In the spring of 2022, after a 72-year wait, the government made public the records of the United States Census for 1950. In preparation for searching the newly released census records, I realized that I was unsure where my parents were living in that year. They had not yet met each other, lived in different parts of the country, and were both 22 years old. In that year, my father was either with his parents in Hastings, Nebraska, or he was in Chicago enrolled in art school, while my mother could have been in Louisville, Kentucky, Birmingham, Alabama, Washington, D.C., or Stuttgart, Germany. Both are gone now, so I thought I had no way of verifying the timeline. Then I remembered that before my mother passed away, she left with me her memoirs. Tucked away in a desk drawer were about 100 handwritten pages complete with exhibits on rule-lined paper and collected in a 2-inch binder. Retrieving the binder, it did not take long for me to learn the answer to my mother's whereabouts in 1950. For the first half of that year, she lived in a boarding house in Washington, D.C., then, she boarded a ship for Europe in August. Finding the answer to my question, I lingered to look over the exhibits my mother had glued to the rule-lined paper. The fact that she had pasted the pictures onto the pages was something I recall criticizing her for having done when she first gave the binder to me. Of course, I now feel wrong about having made that criticism. I had seen most of the pictures and postcards many times before over the years, but on one page were attached 3 items, 2 of which I do recall having seen before. Yet, I am sure I had no prior knowledge of the existence of the 3rd item. The first 2 items were clippings of the obituaries for my maternal grandfather. One was from the Dallas Morning News and the other from the Waco Times-Herald. They both provided the basic information regarding his death, which I already knew about. James M. Dobbs, age 53, former administrative officer of the Soil Conservation Service in Temple, Texas, was found dead in his hotel room. An inquest verdict of the death by natural causes was returned by the Justice of the Peace. He had been ill for several days. He was born July 4, 1902, in Dallas and was a graduate of the University of Georgia Law School in 1923. I am mentioned in both the obituaries and the list of survivors. Survivors include 2 daughters, Mrs. William W. Carlin of Corpus Christi and Mrs. David DeBacker of St. Louis, Missouri, 1 grandchild and 1 half-sister, Mrs. W. H. Smith of Washington, D.C. My mother had been estranged from her father for most of her life. In fact, in her memoir, she mentions him only 3 times. The first is an early memory that she has of him before her parents were divorced in 1932. She was 4 years old, and she remembers that he was tall, thin, and had dark hair. After her parents divorced, she did not see her father for the following 18 years. The next time she saw her father was when he came to see her in Washington, D.C. just before she left for Europe. That was in the summer of 1950. When my parents married in 1954, my grandfather was not invited to the wedding at the insistence of my grandmother. However, according to my mother's memoir, she did see her father one more time, which was a month or 2 after the wedding. She said that he met my father and the 3 of them had dinner together. She describes her father as being tall, thin, with dark hair on both those occasions. In terms of family resemblance, I tend to favor my mother more than my dad, except that I am not blonde. If I were fleeing a crime scene, I am sure that the witnesses would describe me as tall, thin, with dark hair. In the few pictures I have seen of my maternal grandfather, I feel that there is a resemblance between us. I grew up with a photograph of my grandfather taken when he was about 15 years old hanging in my bedroom. Ever since then I have been obsessed with wanting to know more about him. I met my paternal grandfather one time and that was when I was about 4 years old. On the other hand, my maternal grandfather, whose picture hung on my bedroom wall, died when I was about 6 months old. And that brings me to the 3rd item included on the page with the 2 obituaries. This item was a typewritten letter from my grandfather's second wife, Helen Mulhenny Dobbs. The letter was folded such that I probably missed it on the first pass. It was typed on letterhead from the First National Bank of Holland, Texas, dated January 23, 1956. It is addressed to Dear Emmetta, Pat, and Joe, that would be my grandfather's half-sister, my mother, and my Aunt Chua. It begins, "May I suggest that you try to remember Jim as I will try to remember him, as I knew him in earlier days?" This is an apparent reference to the disease of alcoholism that took my grandfather's life. Helen had divorced my grandfather a couple of years before he passed away because of his drinking. According to her privately published autobiography, she did so, hoping that the separation would force him to change. What follows is a beautifully written memorial to my maternal grandfather, James Monroe Dobbs, Jr., written by my step-grandmother. It is something I had no idea existed until yesterday evening.
He was refined and genteel, soft-voiced, appreciative of the finer values of life, polite, cultured, and polished. He was well-educated, had an excellent choice of words, and dictated beautifully. He had an excellent memory and constantly strove to improve his knowledge, parroting out minute details to be better informed. He was competent. Whatever he undertook, he did with precision and perfection. Queer thing, he never liked to tackle a problem a second time but constantly sought new fields of endeavor. He was broad-minded. He always gave a person the benefit of the doubt. If criticism of a person was made in his company, he would invariably say something kind about that person, questioning your authority for any criticism made. He did not like commentators who gave their opinion. He preferred to form his own. He had beautiful features, was always neat in appearance, and was always immaculate in his dress. He liked to do things for those he loved. His workshop was a hobby, and I encouraged it constantly. If he heard me say that I wished I had something made or fixed, he took great pleasure in getting it done. You could not hurry him, but he would get it done in his own time, and it was a perfect job. I think he loved me best when I was ill in bed and he had to wait on me. Whistling or humming a tune, he would tend to me lovingly, cook me good food, and keep the house in order so that things ran smoothly. He was a good sportsman. He loved his guns, took excellent care of them, and kept all the rules for fair hunting. He prized the walnut, handmade, gun rack I gave him. He liked to be systematic and orderly. So do I. I have heard him brag that if he were called to make a trip to Europe and had to pack in the dark, he would still know exactly what he was taking. He loved good literature and music. Often, he read aloud to me and always inspired me to read classics that I failed to read in my small-town schooling. He loved good music so well that he told me that he became an usher in Atlanta at the Opera House in order to see some operas. He loved children. Before he contacted you two daughters, nearly every time he would take a child into his arms, he would shed a tear and hurriedly wipe it away. He often told me of Pat's antics as a baby and how he loved feeding her early morning bottle. Joe's 2 visits to our home brought us both much happiness. It was always a great disappointment that he would never get you, Pat, to come. He presided well. He helped organize a knife and fork club in Temple, and he became its second president, doing a very creditable job. He was a loyal friend. He would go to bat for any man he felt worthy of his esteem. He was a member of the Lions Club and worked indefatigably on the Lions Minstrel each year. His home was his palace, and how he loved it. Both homes in which we lived, he liked and helped select. He could and did show them with pride. Each was paid for at the time of purchase, and that gave him an inner satisfaction that radiated. His first choice of entertainment was to sit and read by his own fireside.
The letter was signed by Helen Dobbs, and it is a beautiful testimony from someone who must have loved my grandfather very much. She makes him sound perfect, although we know that like all humans, he had his flaws. I know that he was guilty of adultery and that he allowed alcohol to take over his life. Nevertheless, having discovered this letter, I feel a sense of closure, and now I feel as though I have a better understanding of who my grandfather was. It was not until a few years after the fact that I learned that my step-grandmother died at the age of 101 in Holland, Texas. She is buried in the Holland Cemetery next to my grandfather, and his mother Helen Spiegel Dobbs, who died in April 1950. There was one other artifact regarding my grandfather's death included in the collection of exhibits in my mother's memoir. It was a Western Union telegram marked PD Atlanta, Georgia via Temple, Texas, January 20, 1956. It was addressed to Mrs. James M. Helen Dobbs, Holland, Texas. There was one line. It read, "I am deeply grieved over Monroe's passing. Am writing, stop love, Cousin Annie." Had I read that telegram 25 years ago, neither my mother nor I would have had any idea who Cousin Annie was. I now know who she was and how she played an important role in my learning the truth about my grandfather's family. Cousin Annie was Annie von Schielhaar, Monroe's aunt by marriage, and aunt of the woman who I first contacted 20-something years ago and provided me access to all of Cousin Annie's genealogical research on the Dobbs and Prothero families. Without Cousin Annie's research efforts in the late 1940s, I would have very little knowledge of my maternal grandfather's family. That's our show for now. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to hit the like button down below, and don't forget to subscribe to the Gathering More Leaves channel.